we're going to be covering a lot of weight-based discrimination and anti-fatness, like the basics and some of the frameworks and things like that that are related. So let me see if I can, okay. So what we're going to be doing today is I'm going to talk a little bit about my story, specifically my experience at Cal, as an undergrad in the early 2000s. We're going to critically examine approaches to the conversation of body size. We'll define and examine fatphobia or anti-fatness. I use those interchangeably, though I still use fatphobia primarily. A brief history of fat activism and some very quick sort of fun models of fat joy and embodiment. Some best practices and frameworks, and then some Q&A. So I kind of want to read, the fastest way I discovered in telling my story was to actually write it down and to read it. So if you'll forgive me, it's on my phone. Yeah, and I kind of want to encourage you as you're listening to any part of this presentation. I'm going to try and create some space to just like allow things to process or for you to ask yourself a question. But I encourage you to take notes if you're having a thought or a feeling. So in the early 2000s, I came as a young adult to UC Berkeley looking for the vibrant radical community of thought leaders and weirdos I had always been seeking. And in many ways, I found it there. I deepened my commitment to anti-racism at Cal. I became a feminist whose life was completely transformed by the feminist principles and community of mostly queer women by which I was surrounded through the DeCal program. I learned about body image, eating disorders, sex work, sex positivity. And in the midst of all that, I was still unknowingly in the throes of a restrictive eating disorder that was undetected because I'm a person of color who has always been fat. There were times while attending Cal that I lived on lettuce and toast, a practice that I had begun when I was 11 years old and trying to lose weight quickly during the summers between 5th and 6th grades. While attending Cal, I practiced strict food rules that disallowed me in the grocery store from going down any aisle that had sweets or dessert or anything that I considered a problem food or a quote unquote fattening food. Most of my romantic experiences began online and ended with one-night stands, often with much older men when I'd gotten too tired to try and fight for normal dating experiences. I did not get to participate in dating the way that my friends who were straight sized did because of the romantic rejection I experienced and had become accustomed to as a fat person. That did not change before Cal or during my experience there. I spent many hours exercising compulsively, but was too afraid to go to the rec center, worried that I would jiggle too much or sweat on something or fall or just be made fun of for being in a gym at all. I sometimes ate in the bathroom to avoid being seen. At no point did anyone exactly say to my face that I was less than or subhuman because of my weight, but Cal was not an interruption from the life of restriction and self-loathing I had grown up with. Even as I was told to love my body in the radical halls of this incredible learning community, I saw no positive representations of fat people. I had no fat professors. I had a political science professor who routinely complained about his wife getting fat after they got married during lectures, and who before one class accused another student, much smaller than me, of looking like the Michelin Man because of her outfit. I attended talks by influential speakers like Raj Patel, who pointed to the overstuffed Americans as evidence of global food system failure and inequality. I remember hating having to go to the Tang Center, avoiding if I could, the way I'd learned to avoid doctors in general, because I had already come to expect nothing but disappointed looks, dispassionate advice to lose weight, encouragement for my weight loss that typically came after periods of overexercise or starvation, or inquiries about my weight problem. On one visit, I recall asking for help with intermittent but fairly acute back pain and being told that I needed to just lose weight. The idea that I should be given pain medication or actual tools was not on the provider's mind. And frankly, it wasn't on my mind either, because I had so deeply internalized the idea that everything bad or painful was caused by my weight, that my weight was my fault, and that I deserved to feel pain because it might motivate me to finally fix my condition. I got illnesses chronically that I strongly suspect in retrospect were caused by malnourishment, my body's inability to fight them because I wasn't eating enough calories, because they never reappeared once I stopped restricting food and I stopped overexercising. I had accepted my discomfort with all of this as unfortunate but normal. And I did not locate the problem in others' bias or discriminatory behavior. I located it only in my own lack of discipline, my own inability to eat even less or to exercise even more. I graduated from Berkeley a more social justice minded person, a more thoughtful person in almost every arena except that of my own fat body. It wouldn't be until I was almost 30 that I would learn what fat phobia is, and that I would be happy that by happenstance meet fat positive community while researching the impacts of weight stigma on gender development in grad school. So you can see that I've painted a picture of a very personal experience, but the holistic reality that many fat people actually experience, from the intrapersonal to the interpersonal to the systemic or institutional. And we'll talk more about those kind of different levels in a second. But, I just kind of want to take a second to take a breath. And, for some people, this might be radically unbelievable, right? Your experience might be totally different from mine. And in fact, there are people in larger bodies who perhaps had a totally different experience than me. I just think it's kind of important to sort of highlight, this is a very legitimate, true, real experience that someone can have this incredible political, thoughtful, community, and have this massive sort of glaring spot where they really can't see that injustice and discrimination is being, happening and produced and perpetuated. So let's continue. We're going to critically examine approaches to the conversation of body size. So the current prevailing question, but isn't being fat just unhealthy, which is kind of the prevailing question when we think about this issue culturally. It leads to victim blaming. It leads to the invisibilization of discrimination and the depoliticization of what is actually a pressing human rights and social justice issue. So individuals who are experiencing discrimination should not be asked to change their bodies or their appearance. Individuals and entities who practice discrimination should be asked not to practice discrimination, which is very intuitive. And yet that's not what we do not see, right? Because of confirmation bias and internalized, bias and stigma, our minds almost bypass this totally obvious logical reality. Because fat phobia and weight discrimination are so prevalent and so normalized, it almost bypasses our normal sort of logical ways of thinking, right? Furthermore, health outcomes always improve when individuals experience less stigma. So again, this is often not considered, right? Like there's this real preoccupation with weight being highly correlated with health or, good health or ill health, but there is no conversation about how stigma and ongoing minority stress, right? Minority stress is a bit of a misnomer, right? Because actually most Americans are in the plus size category, but essentially, stress that's related to marginalized status, how of course this is going to impact health outcomes. So that's often not considered. Okay. So here are some better questions, and I'm going to read them out, and then I'm going to give you like a minute or so to actually kind of pick one that you just kind of want to think about for a second on your own. So other great questions would be, why do we use the BMI, a tool created in the 1800s by a European man whose work went on to undergird eugenics as a measure of health? What would it look like to truly accept what the data are telling us, that a fat person cannot become a thin person? How can we accept that stigma worsens health outcomes and shortens life expectancy when it comes to BIPOC, LGBTQ+, and other marginalized communities, but not accept that those same outcomes are likely caused by weight stigma, which is blatantly practiced socially and is legal in 48 states? Why do doctors prescribe weight loss, a treatment with a very high failure rate, as high as 99%, right? There's a range, but none of them is below 50. None of them is even below 60. I don't even think any of them are below 70. So let's give it the most permissive possible. Why do doctors consistently prescribe something with a 70 to 99% failure rate and that is correlated with anxiety, depression, and increased likelihood of developing an eating disorder? So 25% of quote unquote normal dieters go on to develop an eating disorder because of the progressive nature of food restriction. Essentially, you have to work harder to get the same outcomes as the longer that you restrict, because your body is pushing against basically starvation behavior. Next, what if we stop seeing thinness as the baseline for all bodies and accepted that fatness is a perfectly legitimate baseline for many bodies? What would it look like to approach fatness with curiosity, inquiry, and the spirit of science rather than the stigma-based lens of failure, pathology, and bias? Why do we believe we're promoting someone's health by othering them when we know that stigma shortens life expectancy and leads to poor cardiovascular health or worse cardiovascular health outcomes? And finally, what is the word health hiding about my own internalized views about people in larger bodies? So I'm just going to give you a minute if you need to take a breath or just kind of pick one question to think about. And then I'm just going to let you contemplate that for just a little bit. Okay, gonna have to stop it there, but I encourage you to keep contemplating after the talk. So let's keep going. So we could live in a culture that affirms a pro-human relationship to food and body. Now, I just want to take a second and say, this is a conversation about weight stigma. However, people's cultural understanding about food is very tied up in how people think of weight. So I often, even though there's limitations on the truth to the relationship between food and body size, right? It's certainly not the prevailing cultural view, which is sort of the first law of thermodynamics: calories in, calories out. Doesn't really work. It's not that simple. But often I include conversations about food because people project attitudes about fatness onto food. So that's why it's going to show up in this talk a few times. So we could live in a culture that's sort of, characterized by instinct, hunger, intuition, pleasure, connection, care, cultural affirmation, play, fun, comfort, and self-trust. And, when we look at the people who are anti-diet dietitians, who are critically engaging with diet culture and food restriction and fat phobia, we're learning more and more. There's this growing body of evidence that shows this is kind of really the North Star of what we need to be working towards in the relationship to food and body. Instead, our culture teaches us to be suspicious of these embodied feelings and encourages an intellectual, aka enlightened, anti-human relationship to food and body, characterized by things like binary, so good versus junk food or good versus bad food, wrong versus right bodies, restriction and control, assimilation. People often use food and body as a way to assimilate to white heteronormative ideals of beauty and success, and basically like the body of the legitimate, right, as close as possible. So people, BIPOC and immigrants may use food restriction. I certainly come from an intergenerational family with undetected eating disorders, because it's very difficult to get an eating disorder if you're in a larger body or if you're a person of color. So assimilation can be people can perform proximity or perform aspiration to the American dream through using food and exercise. Utility, so food is primarily seen as something that should promote health. Again, the calories in, calories out ideology, which has origins in European thought that go back to Leonardo da Vinci and probably before him. And then finally, fear. The wrong relationship to food and body could lead to disease and death. And truly, I would say this fear is the biggest characteristic of the American relationship to food and body size and weight. So let's keep going. As a culture, we've been taught to see our bodies and food through a carceral, colonial, and neoliberal lens. So I'm going to break that down. So carceral, right? The belief that our bodies are dangerous and always on the verge of rebellion, with rebellion meaning fatness, justifies the need to punish, ostracize, and dehumanize people with unlawful bodies. And I kind of want to add to that, right? We know carcerality, again, if we look at the data, carcerality is terrible for society, just like that discrimination is terrible for society. And yet we're sort of able to bypass that. Many people are able to bypass that in thinking that, it's that the ends justify the means, right? Like, why are we mean to fat people? Because the ends justify. Why do we incarcerate people? Because the ends justify the means, right? Again, this sort of like very moralistic and in fact quite religious viewpoint that is not really based in data. Colonial, right? The body becomes the savage, quote unquote, or racialized other that must be tamed, disciplined, and governed by the more civilized, coded as white mind. And then neoliberal, right? The individual is responsible for controlling their body. Their body is private property, and they must contain and control that in private property in order to prevent social punishment. So you kind of see like how through diet culture, there's a normalization of a carceral society, of a society that's deeply touched and impacted by colonialism, and where those colonial practices are happening on the most intimate level with food and body, and neoliberalism, which is another major tenet of American society. So moving on to sort of defining and examining what fatphobia and anti-fatness are. I've got a lot of stuff in this section. So what is this, right? It's a socially acceptable form of bigotry against higher weight people, justified through the language of health and morality. And it also encompasses the fear of weight gain. So, you might not be somebody who's in a larger body, socially speaking, but you may live in constant fear of weight gain. And certainly people in larger bodies also live in fear of becoming more stigmatized through gaining weight. So common fatphobic tropes or beliefs includes social sexual insatiability, gluttony, asexuality, the idea that fat bodies are aberrations or unnatural, that fat people are desperate, lazy, selfish, or that are gender imposters. You see a lot of kind of gender line policing that happens in fatphobic discourse. So some facts. So 5 is the age at which most children learn fat phobia in the US. And I would amend this and say this is the age at which they begin to have access, that researchers begin to have access to children through formal education like kindergarten. Actually, by the age of 5, it seems that they've quite clearly internalized fat phobia through asking questions like, would you rather lose an arm or lose a parent or be fat? And the child always chooses whatever not being fat is, no matter how devastating the alternative is. $9,000 is the starting figure for how much income plus size women lose per year, according to a 2014 Guardian article. And this number is as high as $19,000 a year. And then 68% is, again, this is a figure on US women, but in general, 70% of the US population is plus size or in a larger body. So fatphobia manifests in 3 dimensions, which I kind of made a nod to earlier with my story. So the intrapersonal, which is how do I see myself through the lens of fatphobia, right? Do I have like body dysmorphia? Am I terrified of becoming fat? Do I hate looking at myself? Do I hate thinking about my body? Do I hate taking pictures of myself, right? Like all of these kinds of things. The interpersonal is how people treat you based on your body size. And we can kind of see evidence of that again in my story around romantic discrimination, feeling like I'm alienated from my peers who are having more normative dating experiences while I'm having, secret sexual rendezvous with people because I'm tired of trying to advocate for a relationship that actually sees my humanity and not having the tools to be able to do that, or the energy. And then the institutional, right, which is kind of like the medical interface component. It also includes things like, can I fit in an airplane? Can I sit comfortably in a chair? Do I have to look up pictures on Google Maps before I go somewhere? Am I thinking about, like, am I able to buy clothing at the campus bookstore, right? Like, all of these kinds of things are institutional, that are sort of, like the, if you will, like the water in which we're swimming, sort of, and the structures within that. So here's not an exhaustive list, but a long list of examples of fatphobic attitudes or beliefs. Some of these might be kind of surprising. So the belief that higher weight people can become thin people, and that just aren't trying hard enough or haven't found the right method yet, are sick of or have an emotional eating problem. Again, another reason, I imagine, again, a high level of people who are in larger bodies who don't even know they have an eating disorder, and if they do, might get a misdiagnosis as a binge eater, when in fact they might actually be anorexic. And so anyway, like, there's a presumption that people in larger bodies have a disordered relationship to food that is often in the sort of the binging category, that higher weight people are struggling with their weight, that higher weight people want to be thin people, or are less healthy than thin people, or need help, advice, or medical attention inherently, or are less disciplined than thin people, or need to be on a diet, or can't possibly have anorexia or bulimia, are less capable or desirable as a colleague or a candidate, will die young because of their weight, should accept the prevailing public health approach to weight, and should uncritically obey the medical field's advice despite its history of harming people in larger bodies. So these are all kind of, examples of things that are kind of in the ether, in fact, and that even for someone who might be critical of weight discrimination, may have not actually examined this. Like, for example, I've talked to many people who have a robust understanding of weight discrimination, but have never considered the idea that fat people are not failed thin people. That we're not ill or wrong. That maybe, like, for somebody like me, every image of my family that I have, it looks exactly like me. So I consider myself an inheritor of like this body and its archive of like all of these interesting things. So let's continue. So we're going to kind of go through and unpack some of these fatphobic presumptions, which will be on the right-hand side. And then I'll kind of give you some data on the left-hand side. So the idea that fat people should accept the prevailing public health approach to weight. I'll be reading everything on the slide, so you don't need to worry about missing that. And feel free to take a screenshot if you need to. So this is a really important one that I'm going to slow down slightly to read. So health policies routinely emphasize weight loss as a target for health promotion. These policies rest upon the assumptions: 1, that higher body weight equals poorer health; 2, that long-term weight loss is widely achievable; and 3, that weight loss results in consistent improvements in physical health. Our review of the literature suggests that these 3 assumptions underlying the current weight-focused approach are not supported empirically. Oof. Right? Like, again, going back into questions we can ask ourselves, what would it look like to accept this? Right? Like, and I'm thinking about this, it's interesting to think about this from an academic perspective, and, and to look at it from the respectability or the profession, like, what is at risk if we accept this, right? The risk is that important fields have to basically say we were wrong for 100+ years, which is a lot, right? So it's a huge ask, especially when we think of kind of the ways in which respectability and respect are like maintained in academic settings. So there's that. The next one, fat people can become thin people, right? This is from a 2015 paper. You will actually see quite a range of numbers on this, but this is the lowest number that I found, I'll be honest with you. But it was also in this article, everything you know about everything you think about obesity is wrong, and it was kind of one of those standout little facts that was on the sidebar. But according to this paper, the chances a woman classified as quote unquote obese could achieve a quote unquote normal weight. So again, going back to that presumption, you may or may not have heard, I think people here who are in dietetics know about this, but set point theory states that the human body tries to maintain its weight within a preferred range. Many people stay within, and again, this is genetically determined. Many people stay within a more or less small range of body weight throughout their adult life. In set point theory, if you suddenly start eating fewer calories, the way your body burns fuel, your metabolism will slow down. You will burn fewer calories, even if your activity level does not change. Your body may also change the way it absorbs nutrition. Your hormones could change and make you hungrier, right? So again, set point is a genetic marker kind of, right, that says that there's a range in which your unique body thrives. When someone is weight cycling, what culture, the mainstream culture calls dieting, when someone's weight cycling, they're largely just sort of going back and forth between their lowest point in the set point and their highest point, with a general tendency towards going up in weight. What we know about food restriction is that it overall moves towards higher weight, which is actually this genius thing that the body does. It sort of just kicks into survival mode. And it's like, all right, if we're going to be going through intermittent starvation periods, we're actually going to have to create a bigger storage so that we don't die. Many people consider, obviously, right, this genius thing that your body does as very negative and a sign of failure. But it's actually, when you look at kind of the biology, it's actually really fascinating and kind of amazing. Continuing, right? This is actually from Cal, right? Fat people need to be on a diet. And this is from the website, right? Dieters often experience physical consequences such as loss of muscular strength and endurance, decreased oxygen utilization, thinning hair, loss of coordination, dehydration, electrolyte imbalances, fainting, weakness, slowed heart rates. Medical studies indicate that people on diets have slower reaction times, and a lesser ability to concentrate than people not on a diet. Numerous studies link chronic dieting with feelings of depression, low self-esteem, increased stress. Health professionals note that patients with eating disorders were dieting at the time of the development of the eating disorder, which goes back to one of the statistics I shared earlier about the increased likelihood of dieters to then sort of go into becoming, someone with an eating disorder. Honestly, it was very exciting to see this on a university medical sort of like health services website. So let's keep going. So this is a little bit reiterating, but I just kind of think it's important, right? Food restriction, aka dieting, is not correlated with long-term weight loss, but it is correlated with an increased likelihood of an eating disorder, depression, delaying of important life moments, anxiety, binging. A lot of people don't know this, but food restriction is what leads to binging. So they're like, it's like yin and yang. They're like they're the completion of a cycle. Disconnection from hunger cues, worse long-term decision making. There's this really interesting study that somewhat recently came out of the University of Glasgow that studied how basically like short-term fasting impacted decision making, and it worsened long-term decision making around money and like some other interesting, like unrelated to, like these studies have been done around food motivation, but this study actually looked at other things, and it was really fascinating to see that in general what food restriction does is it takes this wide open field that our cerebral cortex is capable of like taking in, right, and it kind of just like it makes your entire life about like short term, just getting rid of the discomfort of being hungry. And so that's a really unfortunate outcome of food restriction, but is a common one. And then obviously the ongoing discomfort of being hungry. And it's important to understand that hunger is not just a glycolic reality, right? Like, for example, if you took my blood right now, you could see the presence or absence of the hormone that indicates, fullness or hunger. But there's also a subjective hunger, right? Like a sense of, can I eat what I want? want? Can I eat to the point of being full? And many dieters or people experiencing weight discrimination or dealing with that through food do not feel like they can actually eat to the point where they're full or eat as much as they want. So there's sort of, it's important to understand that there's a biological, like a physiological reality of hunger. There's also a subjective psychological experience of hunger. So let's keep going. So the idea that fat people are inherently less healthy than thin people. This is, this research comes from Janet Tomoyama, who's at UCLA, who everyone should put on in their notepad because she's amazing. Like she started out as kind of a quote unquote obesity researcher, and then discovered the science was so clear about the fact that you can't turn a fat person into a thin person, the diets are terrible, that she completely like went the other direction and just has dedicated her career to debunking in these sort of through journals and her research, diet culture and fat phobia. So using BMI categories as the main indicator of health, an estimated 75-ish million US adults are misclassified as cardiometabolic unhealthy or cardiometabolic healthy. Again, right, that's a huge margin. 25% margin of error is pretty enormous. So again, like how are we allowing these, I would say like negligent and unethical margins of error just continue? So that anyway, moving forward, higher BMI was associated with less frequent receipt of preventive services among middle-aged white women and elderly white women and men, right? So again, when we're looking at health outcomes, we have to really look at the reality of what fat phobia creates, right? Which is among many other things, some of which I've mentioned. There's less, you're receiving less preventive services. Like my example of going in wanting to be proactive about my back pain and leaving with a prescription to continue to have an eating disorder, you can kind of see how the cyclicality of this issue leads to, right? Like you get stigmatized at the doctor. This creates delays in receiving services. So this means that you're getting fewer things treated. And when you are going to the doctor, you're going in your most acute state, right? You have waited till the absolute worst moment, like it's gotten so bad that you actually cannot avoid going to the doctor. Then a doctor sees a fat person in an acute state of ill health, and the confirmation bias is confirmed. So it kind of just, and again, we see this phenomenon with other marginalized groups. And we see it with people in larger bodies as well. So continuing, right? And again, on the shorter lives than thin people, Rebecca Hiles, who 28, at the age of 28, or she was 28 during this interview, said she was told by doctors that her health problems were related to her weight. But it turns out that Hiles was suffering from cancer. And in fact, Rebecca Hiles, she was trying to get help. She was having these debilitating coughing attacks. And I think she was 19 or 20 when they started to happen. Went into the doctor, was just told that she was fat, and that's why she had these problems with her lungs. And then she finds out that she has cancer, right? So this is, I've talked to many fat people. I have at least 10-ish anecdotal stories of people who had their cancer diagnosis basically delayed for sometimes years because of fat phobia, right? So again, are we accounting for this when we're thinking about our ideas of fat people? And this one is probably one of the most sort of devastating pieces of data that I have found in my 11 years of doing this work. Weight discrimination was associated with an increase in mortality risk of nearly 60% in participants. This was a huge study with tens of thousands of participants. This increased risk was not accounted for by common physical and psychological risk factors, in addition to association with poor health outcomes. Weight discrimination may shorten life expectancy. So in this study, it was really striking because they were able to find that ongoing weight discrimination was more correlated with an increased mortality risk than almost any other category. And I think some of this can be understood through the fact that weight discrimination is completely socially normalized for the most part. And there's no legal recourse against it. In almost every state in the United States. So let's keep going. So this is Adolf Alay, the Belgian mathematician who invented the BMI. He also invented the concept of the ideal man when he was testing the BMI. It was invented in the 1830s. He only used white male subjects who were in the military. And as we all know, the BMI is still used as the ultimate measure of health in the United States. Now, it's interesting, right? Like going back to this ideal man thing, you start to see the emergence of eugenics, right? Because what he's doing with the BMI is that he's weighing all of these soldiers, and then he's doing a basic average, right? Which creates like a bell curve. So he's like, number of pounds, if I add them together, divided by the number of people, and he comes up with a bell curve. And what he does, he looks at the data and he decides that the median is the ideal man. Just arbitrarily, there's nothing scientific about that decision. He just decided that that's the ideal man, and then people deviate from that and are inferior to that ideal man. And so anyway, so I mean, I don't think I need to belabor this. I think the problematic nature of this is kind of like apparent, but if you can kind of take it to another level, like a higher level, what is the impact of bringing this eugenicsy tool, even though it's been modified, sort of like, to sort of account for the population as it exists now to a certain extent, right? What does it mean to bring that tool as we're assessing the health of, non-white people and non-male people and all of these things? So this is a quote from Dr. Sabrina Strings from Fearing the Black Body, the Racial Origins of Fatphobia. And in her book, she argues that fatphobia or anti-fatness is connected to histories of slavery, colonialism, and anti-Blackness, and that fat bodies become racially coded. Even if they're a white body, the fat body becomes racially coded through the anti-Black racist rhetoric that emerged during this very specific period in time. Here's one of the quotes from her book. Two critical historical developments contributed to a fetish for svelteness and a phobia about fatness: the rise of the transatlantic slave trade and the spread of Protestantism. Racial scientific rhetoric about slavery linked fatness to quote unquote greedy Africans, and religious discourse suggested that overeating was ungodly. So again, you kind of see like in words like greedy and ungodly, right? Very clear references to religion and morality. And it's being justified through racial science, like through racist science. So we're seeing, it's the same, we're on the same train, right? Like, how do concepts like greed and ungodliness become measurable through science? Well, through bigotry, right? That's how that happens. So let's keep going. This is another sort of an expansion of the neoliberalism conversation we started earlier, but neoliberalism maps completely onto healthism, which is very connected to fatphobia. Healthism is a belief system that sees health as the property and responsibility of the individual and ranks the personal pursuit of health above anything else. Now, in 1 second, I'm going to show you a slide that shows this is not based in data. But for now, I'm just going to, basically, this is based in a complex, problematic history and the myth of rugged self-sufficiency that denies the realities of how much America benefited from slavery, genocide, colonialism, and how laws and structures have been set up to artificially bolster some at the expense of others, right? So neoliberalism is like this kind of like this sort of mythology, this propaganda about this imagined story about what the history of the United States is, as this sort of like chosen special son who just works so hard that he's just he's just like the top of the world, right? Anyway, I know everyone here is familiar with this, so I'll keep going. So our overall health is, in fact, determined by a combination of social and individual determinants. So social determinants include things like, did you experience trauma in childhood? Or do you have access to clean water? Do you have access to medical care? And again, with the childhood trauma thing, it's like, things like, is there a prison? It was your parent, like, I mean, I think this one might actually go over in the individual, so I misplaced that, but let's continue. Access to clean water, access to medical care, access to public transportation, whether you experience oppression, right? And then individual determinants include things like food and diet, movement and exercise, genetics, These are like, again, when we're talking about genetics, this is an enormous category. And yet the only individual determinant of health that we ever are sort of told about is food and diet and movement and exercise. And social determinants are really very rarely discussed in the greater social sense of like, talking about what health is. So I often ask people how much individual determinants of health impact our overall health. And I ask them to guess as compared to social determinants. And the spoiler here, because we're sort of running out of time, is that it's anywhere between 30 and 40%. The CDC says 30%. Kaiser says 40%. And again, within that 30 to 40% figure is genetics, which I wasn't able to get an exact figure on what percentage within that piece of the pie is actually genetics, but I would venture to guess that it's a large piece of the pie. So I just kind of want to zoom out and say, we're looking at a pie here where, let's call it, I'm more inclined toward the CDC figure because I think it's a little bit less biased than Kaiser. But let's call it, like a big piece of the pie here, 70% of the pie of your overall health is stuff you have no control over. And then in that remaining 30% is more stuff you have no control over, which is genetics. And then some remaining part of that is how you eat and how you move. So let's continue. This doesn't mean that individual behaviors don't matter. They do. And they're part of creating a meaningful life. But why are we more determined to shift the 30 to 40% figure than the 60 to 70% figure, right? Like, and there's obvious reasons why it's easier to make changes on an individual scale. But when we're looking at issues of like social determinants being an enormous part of your overall health outcomes, it makes much more sense. It's much more pragmatic to try and shift the systems and that are kind of creating these outcomes than to ask individuals to self-flagellate and try and change things that, again, data are saying that they really can't. So let's move on. So a brief history of fat activism and models of fat joy and embodiment. This is a really quick history that you may or may not know about. So fat activism kind of officially, according to the records, began in 1969 with what's called a fat in organized in Central Park. And the New York Times even wrote about it. 1967. That fat in, or that kind of demonstration, right? People are gathered, about 500 people are in Central Park. They're holding up signs, they're burning diet books, right? And they're kind of just trying to say it's okay to be fat, right? It's okay to be fat. It's okay for me to eat. It's okay for like fat people to exist. And then quickly kind of following that is the establishment of NAFA that's in 1969, the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance, which is actually started by a straight white dude. It's like NAFA is really focused on acceptance and kind of changing cultural attitudes about fat people. Closely on the heels of that, Fat Power is written, whatever you weigh is right. Coming out of that, a radical basically a radical chapter of NAFA ends up sort of deciding that NAFA's politics are a little bit too palatable. And a lot of them are women, a lot of them are Jewish queer women. And they end up creating what is called the Fat Underground. And they, very inspired by the Black Power movement, end up writing the Fat Liberation Manifesto, which I encourage you to look up. I will not be reading all of that today. But I think it's exciting to see the manifesto. It's sad to see that the demands are very relevant still in 2022. These demands have not been met.
I'm going to take a screenshot on the computer.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah.
And then, I'm sorry, I hope you got the screenshot. I can take, okay. And then I'm going to keep going. Then you kind of see, this immersion of like really kind of almost like this whimsical, coming out of this radical sect of NAFA, who's like the Fat Underground, you begin to see this kind of like immediate sort of whimsical sexuality focus, like very clear world building around what it could mean to be fat. And this is just one example of like literature that came out of that time that was like self-published, that was distributed among folks in this small grassroots, really rad movement. But you can kind of see in these images like the joy and the art and the fun and like kind of again like being in a bathtub and having like parts of your body visible on the front page of a zine that your friends and your community are going to have all over the United States, maybe beyond. It's like this immediate kind of response to fat phobia as this like demanding that fat people be muted and sad and depressed and covered up and joyless. And you can kind of see the clapback in the aesthetics of Fat Girl, which you then continue into the fat activism movement, which is what I came into in like 2009. And immediately I'm immersed in this community of like amazing fat people who are like loving and in relationships and eating delicious things and wearing tight clothes and crowdsourcing solutions. Like I remember one of the first workshops I ever attended at a fat conference was how to adjust clothing to being fat. At that time, there were very, very, very few options where it was nowhere. It was the moment that we're in plus size fashion now was nowhere in sight at that time. So a lot of this is an insight into like my world and my little circle of like amazing folks who are around me. We're almost done. Oh my goodness. We have like 9 minutes left. I'm gonna have to rush through some of the best practices and frameworks. I'm sorry. But I'm happy to send the presentation also, or you can see the recording. So, I mean, ultimately, I feel like the big North Star question for me is how do we shift the focus of food and body away from the fear of disease and death, the carcerality, the colonialism, and toward joy, positivity, and aliveness, right? Aliveness is literally the solution to colonialism, I feel, to carcerality and all of these things, right? Like right, when we talk about necropolitics, obviously the solution to that would be, to celebrate aliveness and and orient processes towards this. So food positivity, which I'm going to define, and fat positivity, which I'll also define, are about creating spaces and cultures where our relationship to food and body is characterized by the very things I mentioned at the beginning: intuition, pleasure, celebration, connection, care, ease, comfort, safety, and cultural affirmation. I want to say in this moment, one question that blew my mind from a colleague who is a PhD, like she's like I don't think it's she has a PhD in nutrition, and she teaches up in Canada. And one question that she posed to me that really shifted how I understood all of this work was, if science and medicine are not improving the lives of people, then what is it doing, right? Like we have to understand medical care, medical interventions, science, the development of research. We have to understand them in the context of improving human lives, including people who are marginalized. So, I think that like, again, this became my North Star, right? Like, how do we do this, right? And how do we let people create this for themselves? I recommend adopting fat positivity. And here are some of the principles, right? Seeing fat bodies as natural and a beautiful part of body diversity. Understanding that weight gain or weight restoration can be very positive, an important part of healing for people of all sizes who have a history of restriction, have a history of self-loathing or disordered eating. Not seeing fat people as failed thin people. Fat people are not thin people at all. So seeing fat phobia as the problem that needs to be fixed, not fat bodies, not having weight dependent policies and ideologies, right? So like if you have a belief, like for example, food shaming is a great example, right? Like some people believe that it's great to be food positive, but up to a limit, right? If you're like this size, and you probably should be less food positive, or you should enjoy food, but if you're this size, then you probably should enjoy food less. I think that's kind of what I'm talking about. Understanding that fatness is not merely adipose tissue, but is connected. And like, again, this disembodied idea that a real person exists inside of a fat person. This is the belief that adipose tissue is sort of this sort of accidental like failure, sort of thing, when in actuality it's connected to emotion, memory, identity, culture, and often also trauma. Not asking or pondering invasive questions like, how did you get this way? Do you have an eating disorder? Creating access for fat people in the three dimensions I mentioned, the intra, inter, and institutional, and imagining fat joy, love, thriving, and futurity. That is fat people in the future. And if you are a fat person, imagining yourself aging and getting to 60 and 70 and 80 years old, right? Adopting anti-diet food positive principles. So all food is good food. Adopting a positive, non-judgmental attitude towards all foods. Yes, even food that is labeled as quote unquote junk food. Food restriction is correlated with worse health outcomes, and accepting that intuitive eating is not for everyone. Healthy eating can include all kinds of foods, as well as periods of making up for history of restriction. Lowering the stakes of food and eating. No, every bite does not count, right? Unless you have a diagnosis and an illness or an allergy, right? Every bite of food does not count. And I learned this from a nutritionist, right? Understanding that food is not just fuel, but is connected to emotion, memory, identity, comfort, and culture. Letting go of categorizing food into binaries, good, bad, healthy, unhealthy. Not presuming someone eats a certain way based on their body size. Trusting our appetites and food desires, and having fun with and enjoying food actually matters. Some more useful practices: not talking about how you or others eat. Hiring fat people, not talking about food restriction or your others' weight at work or with clients or with students, not having weight dependent team building activities, like do not have like a spelunking activity or like a horse riding activity that's sort of, or indoor skydiving or something where there's only like shirts that go through small through XL, right? Like any of those things are not going to be team building for people in larger bodies. Not asking invasive questions about someone's weight, eating habits, or body size. Not offering unsolicited advice. Creating access for fat people in three dimensions. We talked about that earlier. And then this is really the last slide. So planning, right? Anti-oppression work often requires more time, more feedback, more inquiry, and I think also like more humility. Creating access. So the size of chairs, the size of medical equipment. Like one of my big things was it was always difficult to advocate to get a blood pressure cuff that actually fit my arm, so I wouldn't have my arm squeeze and all these blood vessels popped by the time I left an appointment. Do potential clients or students know you're invested in this work? Do colleagues know? And how? Is it on a website? Where does it live? Do you have language that indicates you're anti-diet or practice weight neutrality? Do you have body diverse imagery? And what do your assets look like on your website, on, wherever images are? Knowledge, which we built a lot of today. So what are fatphobia and how do they manifest? What is fatphobia? How does it manifest, etc.? A lot of flexibility, curiosity, and self-compassion, and just a lot of practice, kind of doing it over and over and over again. So that was very long. We have basically 2 minutes from Q&A. I'm really sorry about that. But thank you. And these are some of my projects. So like these are 3 books I've written, and then this is my podcast, Rebel Eaters Club, which could be resources for you if you'd like. So thank you so much.
That was amazing, Virgie. So chock-a-block full of great stuff. Thank you so much. And there's a few questions that seem like they could take another hour to talk about because they're, complex. But the first one I thought was great, from Kat. She asked, what's something you wished you knew when you were in college, or something you'd tell your college self?
Oh my goodness. I mean, like college is such an interesting, being an undergrad is such a special moment because you really are having food freedom. Many people are having food freedom and like body freedom to a certain extent for the first time. And I think that, I guess like to begin with, right, I wish that I had known to, or have been advised to find fat community right away, right? I think that I wish that I had supportive community that was there helping me understand that I had this very disordered attitude towards food, and helping me recover. Like, I think, it was in a I mean, it's hard, right? Because like I think about the level of intimacy and trust that's required to do that work, but I wonder, I wish that there was a more socially normal way in which that information could be communicated. I think that I also would have told myself to like self advocacy for me became one of the my biggest tools that I learned as a feminist, and I brought it with me immediately into medical settings, and it really changed. I think a lot of the outcomes and the experiences of like feeling empowered in medical settings. So, I guess I mean, I wish I had more time to think about that. Those are the things off the top of my head.
Great, thank you. There's praise for you here in the chat.
Oh.
I hope you have a second to look at, but feel free to come back on, everybody, if you want to. I think that we will share the recording, and right, Virgie, we can share the slides out afterwards.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I hope we can keep the conversation going. In the survey, there's a place for you to leave your email if you want to stay in touch about this work or even join our work group. And, we meet once a month and we talk deeply about these issues. And we knew that we needed some help from an expert on the topic, which is why we invited Virgie. And so we really, really appreciate your time, Virgie. And thank you to everybody for coming today.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much.